Hi, my name is Andrew Sutherland, and I want to drastically reduce and eliminate for most the U.S. federal individual income tax. And in the process, I want to create millions of jobs. I want to create high-paying jobs. I want to supercharge economic growth. I want to balance the budget, pay down the debt, restore interest rates to normal levels, which will be good for those living on fixed incomes. I want to establish the U.S. dollar as the top currency in the world, which will allow more Americans to travel. I want to stimulate small businesses and pretty much solve most of our economic problems. I know, sounds ambitious. Funny thing, all of this can be accomplished by paying attention to one simple fact. That's it. Just one fact that's supported by decades of data. Data that's used by every single financial institution in the world. Now, before I get to that fact, I'll let you know how the process will work. Eliminating the individual income tax will give Americans $1 trillion a year raise. $1 trillion. That's a lot of zeros. All those making $100,000 a year or less will pay zero in income tax. You can make $100K a year and keep it all, except for estate taxes. Those making $100,000 to $200,000 a year will pay 5%. $200,000 to $500,000 a year, 7.5%. $500,000 to $1 million a year, and you'll only pay 10%. You can make $1 million a year and only pay 10% in federal individual income tax. The rates gradually go up from there until we hit those making $5 million to $10 million a year. These people won't see much of a reduction in their individual income tax, maybe only a couple of percent. Now, not all taxpayers will see a reduction. Those making $10 million to $50 million a year will see their taxes go up. They currently pay about 28%, and under my plan, they'll pay 40%. And those making over $50 million a year will pay 50% in income tax. Now, these last two groups, I'm not all that concerned about. You're making at least $10 million a year, you're fine. So what's the first thing that's going to happen after the tax cut? Inflation is sure to rise. You can't inject $1 trillion into the economy and think inflation's going to stay the same. But that's okay. Everyone will know what's about to happen, and the Fed will act. How does the Fed fight inflation? It raises the interest rate. This has been a proven response since Paul Volcker first implemented it in the 70s. Increasing interest rates aren't necessarily a bad thing. They're great for the elderly, like our parents and our grandparents, and the disabled, such as some of our vets, who rely on fixed income to live. Increasing interest rates will provide more money for these people. $1 trillion of additional consumption is sure to drive economic growth. Currently, U.S. consumer spending accounts for about 70% of GDP, or about $13.5 trillion. An additional $1 trillion is an increase of 7.5%. All of this additional consumer spending has to go somewhere, and that's to corporations in the form of revenue. Corporations will have an additional $1 trillion of revenue to fight over, which is sure to drive economic growth. All of this growth will create new jobs, lots of new jobs. And the government will help with this too. More on that in a bit. Companies seeing massive growth coming will need people to satisfy that demand. Competition for those people, for almost any person, is sure to drive wages much higher. That's good for all Americans. So we'll create millions of jobs, we'll create good-paying jobs, we'll drive economic growth, we'll drive wage growth. But how do we balance the budget? How do we pay down the debt? Here's where that fact comes in. The past few years, in reality the last 15 to 20 years, people have been trying to figure out how to stimulate economic growth. And every election cycle, we hear people wishing for the good old days. So I decided to take a look. And the people were right. Decades ago, from an economic perspective, they were the good old days. From 1950, which is pretty much the beginning of the modern macroeconomic climate in which we live, the Second World War had just ended, the Bretton Woods Agreement was being ratified, the Treaty of Rome was being finalized, the IMF and the World Bank were created. From 1950 to 1986, a period of 37 years, U.S. GDP growth averaged 3.7%. That's pretty good. And 13 times, real U.S. GDP growth exceeded 5%. That's crazy good. Today, over the last few decades, from 1988 through today, real GDP growth averaged 2.5%. In the first time period, it was 3.7%. Now it's 2.5%. And the number of times growth exceeded 5%, 0. Not even once. So I agree with the conventional wisdom that the good old days were truly good, at least from an economic perspective. And recently, we've heard from our politicians and our economists that we need to lower the corporate income tax rate to stimulate growth. So I looked at that, fully expecting that today, corporate income tax rates would be a lot higher than they were in the past. If lower corporate income tax rates leads to higher growth, and we had higher growth in the past, we must have had lower corporate income tax rates. What I found was the opposite. In the first time period, the one with 3.7% growth, corporate income tax rates were 50%. Now, they're 35%. This is the often heard Reagan tax cuts, which were supposed to lead to all kinds of prosperity and growth. Whoops. And the crazy thing is, we just did it again. Paul Ryan and all of the other wicked smart people who manage our society just rammed through $1.5 trillion tax cut, thinking this time it's going to be different. There's only about 70 years of true factual data that shows that lowering the corporate income tax rate does not lead to higher growth. It does not. I understand that there's a lot of theory around this. I have a master's degree in international finance from the London School of Economics, and I've dissected those theories, and they're just that, theory. These theories have zero basis in reality, none. The assumptions of these theories are easily disproven. And as any self-respecting scientist will tell you, when you can disprove the assumptions of a theory, the theory is invalid. And yet, we just did it again. And you know, when you think about it, cutting the corporate income tax rates doesn't make sense. From a society's perspective, we don't want lower corporate income tax rates. Think of it this way. When a business owner gets $1 of revenue, there are only one of two things she can do with it. She can either spend it or she can save it. That's it. It's the very first decision a business owner makes. Now, we as a society, we want companies spending that dollar of revenue. Companies spending that revenue create jobs, give raises, build plants, buy equipment, all of the good economic activities that we as a society want. When a company saves that dollar of revenue, it becomes profit, which turns into cash, which sits idly in a bank account, not doing any of the good economic activities we want. So my question is, why are we incenting bad behavior? By cutting the corporate income tax rate, what we're telling business owners is the more you save, the more you keep. And who doesn't like keeping more money? I know I do. I like more cash than less cash. We're incenting bad behavior by cutting the corporate income tax rates. The theory, again, notice the word theory. The theory is that by cutting the corporate income tax rate, we'll give more cash to corporations who will then use it to create jobs and give raises and do the economic activities that we want. Right now, today, corporations have $2 trillion in cash in their bank accounts, and yet they need more. Hey man, I'm feeling kind of skint today. I've only got $2 trillion. Do you think you can cut me a break? Really? This policy of cutting the corporate income tax rates to stimulate growth is just stupid. It makes no sense from a societal perspective. We want companies spending that revenue, not saving it. Companies don't need the money anyways. They have $2 trillion in cash and counting. And there's 70 years of data that says it does not work. That's the fact. Cutting the corporate income tax rate does not stimulate growth. If anything, it inhibits it. Now, don't take my word for it. I'm lying to you. When I did my research, I went to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. I went to the Congressional Budget Office. I went to the White House's Office of Management and Budget. I went to the Federal Reserve System, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the Census Bureau. And this data around US GDP is used by every single financial institution in the world. And the US corporate historical income tax rate is widely available. These are the exact two data points that we have been discussing. What other data is relevant? So now we've established a fact. Cutting the corporate income tax rates does not lead to growth. We know that by eliminating the individual income tax, we'll unleash $1 trillion of consumer spending. We'll restore interest rates to normal, whatever that means, and provide those living on fixed incomes with more money. But how do we balance the budget? How do we pay down the debt? This next chart shows where the U.S. government will get its revenue under the proposed economic plan. The left side is where the government currently gets its revenue. The right side is under the plan. First thing, you can see that individual income taxes fall by $1 trillion. Next, you can see how much money we'll get from corporations, over $1 trillion. Social Security taxes remain the same, as does customs and excise taxes and estate taxes. Under the proposed plan, you'll see a new line, the currency adjustment tax, and there's a big number next to it, $780 billion. What is this? Simply put, this is a currency tax on imports. I know, lots of groans, just hear me out. When we give Americans $1 trillion a year raise as a result of cutting the individual income tax, and the Fed increases interest rates to offset the coming inflation, what happens to the exchange rate? It goes up. There's a concept in international finance called the interest rate differential, and it's a primary mover of the exchange rate. As U.S. interest rates rise vis-a-vis other countries, foreign investors will want to invest more in America because it pays a higher return. They don't care about inflation. They don't live in America. All they want to do is make money off America. This increase in demand for U.S. dollars, you can't buy U.S. Treasury debt with anything other than a U.S. dollar. So foreign investors will be forced to exchange their local currencies for the USD. This increase in demand will drive the greenback up, and significantly so. With an increasing dollar, imports become cheaper. The VIG, which is what I call the currency adjustment tax, is the U.S. government's way of keeping the benefit of a stronger dollar, which is a direct result of the policies implemented by the U.S. government. So why shouldn't we get to keep it? Here's an example. The U.S. dollar currently buys $1.30 Canadian. A pint of Canadian maple syrup costs $10 US. So the U.S. consumer spends $10, which gets converted to 13 Canadian dollars, and the Canadian producer gets 13 Canadian. Now, U.S. interest rates rise to offset the inflation as a result of giving Americans $1 trillion a year raise. Foreign investors buy more U.S. dollars, pushing the dollar up. And now, the U.S. dollar buys $1.60 Canadian. It's gotten stronger. The U.S. consumer was okay with paying $10 for the pint of maple syrup. However, now that $10 generates 16 Canadian dollars. The Canadian producer still only needs 13 Canadian dollars, as her cost to produce the maple syrup hasn't changed. That leaves 3 Canadian dollars, or the VIG, and this is what the U.S. government gets to keep. The U.S. consumer is no worse off, as he used to spend $10 and he still spends $10. The Canadian producer is no worse off, as she used to get 13 Canadian and she still gets 13 Canadian. And the American society is much better off as we're able to balance our budget and create a surplus. No one loses, and America and all of her 330 million citizens gain. That's a good trade. That's a great trade. And, as an added bonus, Americans who travel internationally will find it a lot cheaper because the dollar will go a lot further in local currencies because it's the king dollar. Next is the additional tax revenue from the increase in consumer spending. Of the $1 trillion in tax cuts, approximately $975 billion will be spent, according to an analysis by the San Francisco Federal Reserve. At the average S&P 500 margin, this will result in about $620 billion of pre-tax profit. Taxed at 50%, results in additional revenue of $308 billion. Another line in the proposed plan is a gas tax. Yes, I know, more taxes. This tax will generate approximately $150 billion a year, and it helps with budgeting. And According to data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, from an article in Motley Fool in 2017, the average American uses 656 gallons of gas a year. Mostly eliminating and reducing the individual income tax will provide the average taxpayer a savings of over $11,000 per year. Giving $656 or $1 a gallon gas tax to get over $11,000 is a good trade. And it'll also be additional incentive to move people off fossil fuels, which is another good outcome. And finally, a couple of additional revenue enhancement opportunities. A financial transactions tax will generate about $100 billion a year, and it may help to deaden the impact of high-frequency traders. And a greenhouse gas tax will also generate about $100 billion a year. Companies emitting carbon dioxide place a heavy burden on our society. So why shouldn't we get some benefit to help offset that cost? And it'll help with the budgeting. As you can see, this integrated, fact-based approach to macroeconomic policy results in government revenue of about $5 trillion, 4.9 and change. As with any disruptive idea, this will take a bit to shake out. I propose capping government spending at $4.4 trillion for 2 years. The easiest way to do this is just to fund at 2019 levels. At an annual budget surplus of $500 billion, these 2 years will enable us to pay down $1 trillion in debt, get our financial house in order, and provide time for us together to best decide how to move forward with a balanced budget. There are some very large issues for America to deal with. Our water system. It's estimated by the American Water Works Association in an article with NPR in 2014 that the water system in America leaks 2.1 trillion gallons each year. Our electrical system has sections of it that are over 100 years old, and none of it was designed to handle alternative forms of energy like rooftop solar or wind generation. Our roads and our bridges. No more stories of collapsing infrastructure killing our people. Yes, these are all large projects, each estimated to cost $1 trillion. However, with our budget surplus and the fact that we can spread these projects out over 10 or 15 years so that each project doesn't cost more than $100 billion in a year, we'll be able to easily afford investing in our infrastructure and pay down the debt. America currently has $23 trillion in debt. And if we spent $200 billion, which is less than 5% of our operating budget, it will still take over 110 years to pay off our debt. But we'll be living within our means, and we'll be honoring our word. And as each year passes and we pay off more of the debt, we'll have to devote less of the federal operating budget to making interest payments. America will finally have its fiscal house in order, and our economy will be booming. And my final point is stimulating small businesses. America is great at many things, and making money is one of the things America is great at. Every politician pays lip service to small businesses, the financial backbone of our economy, the economic engine of America. So I decided to take a look. According to the Small Business Administration, there are over 28 million small businesses in America. They've created 2/3 of the net new jobs over the last 50 years. They're responsible for over 99% of all U.S. companies. Spending at small businesses creates 3.5 times more wealth for the local community than spending at big box retailers. They account for over half of all corporate sales, and they employ almost 57 million Americans. Yes, I agree. Small businesses are the heart of America, and I should know. I've worked in startups and small businesses for the last 20 years. I'm currently a co-founder of a small business, and small businesses hire people. Robots and automation are taking over the world. Slowly but surely, corporations are investing in self-driving cars. What happens to all of the taxi cab drivers, or the truck drivers, or the Uber and Lyft drivers when cars drive themselves? Cashier-less shopping. It's estimated that 5 million Americans earn a living from being a cashier. Artificial intelligence in call centers. Computers are getting really good at voice recognition, and they can answer some of the more rudimentary questions all on their own. There's even a startup in Japan that has a warehouse that's completely staffed by robots. They boast about this as progress and efficiency. But progress and efficiency don't put bread on the table. What happens if you can't program in Java or C++ or whatever other current computer language is in vogue? Small businesses don't do this. Why? Small businesses don't have the money to go out and buy $1 million robot. Small businesses hire people. Remember, half of America works in a small business. So again, I had some questions and I did my homework. The Small Business Administration, the federal agency specifically tasked with caring for America's small businesses, has an annual operating budget of $781 million. The U.S. federal annual operating budget is $4.4 trillion. So, for the one thing that everyone agrees on is critical to America's success, we invest less than 0.02%. Small businesses are America's economic engine, and yet we feed them with an eyedropper, less than 0.02%. Wow, this seems really short-sighted. We could easily triple or quadruple funding to the Small Business Administration, and we'd still spend less than 1%, less than 0.5%. Increasing funding for small businesses will drastically create more jobs. Small businesses hire people, not machines. Entrepreneurship is in America's DNA. The biggest and best companies in the world are American. And some of these new small businesses will become the next large corporations. Microsoft and Google each started out with only 2 people. And these new large corporations will be taxed at 50%, thereby generating more revenue for America. It's a feedback loop. We give Americans $1 trillion a year raise from corporations who don't need the cash anyway. That drives corporate revenue, which drives corporate profit. Taxed at 50% balances our budget and fixes our roads and bridges, water and power grids, funds investment in small businesses, who hire more people, who spend more money, which drives more corporate revenue, which drives more government revenue, funds more small businesses, who hire more people, and on and on. Now, it's not all rosy. There are a couple of negatives. Exports, for one, will get hit. With the appreciating dollar, these products will become a lot more expensive. However, I believe there's a longer-term solution for this, but that's definitely a political question. And with the increased consumer spending and the associated increase in corporate revenue, there's going to be an increase in demand for workers, which America seems to have a shortage of. There are currently more job openings than job seekers. But that statement's a bit misleading. Yes, there are currently more job openings than people looking for work, but the number of people looking for work is at multi-decade lows. Large amounts of the American workforce have just given up on looking for a job. The labor force participation rate is 63%. Just 20 years ago, in 1999, the labor force participation rate was 67%. Doesn't seem like much, 4%. But that 4% represents 10 million more jobs. With all of this economic activity, getting back to what we've already done, if not even higher, isn't unrealistic. All of this increased activity will bring more people back into the workforce, which means they'll start earning more money than they've had, which means they'll start spending more money than they've had, which will drive additional economic activity, resulting in more revenue for the government to continue funding critical infrastructure, investments in small businesses, and many, many social programs. Again, it's all based on one simple fact. Cutting the corporate income tax rate does not stimulate growth. And the best thing about my approach, I'm an independent. I've been a registered independent for the last 20 years. So both Republicans and Democrats can get behind this plan and not have to worry about giving them, whoever them is, any credit. This is truly a bipartisan plan that helps all Americans, regardless of political affiliation, and everyone can take credit. In conclusion, this plan is based on fact and data, logic and reason. It benefits all Americans and solves most of our problems. Please speak to your member of the House of Representatives or either of your senators about this. I've sent this plan to each and every one of their offices throughout the United States. And don't let them dismiss this without providing you the data that disproves it. Simply saying, no, this won't work, doesn't cut it. We've suffered far too much for way too long to be summarily dismissed. Have them prove to you why. I've provided fact and data and the source of that fact and data. Demand the same from them. And if they don't, then you'll know who sides with corporations and lobbyists and easily disproven theory versus fact, data, and the American people. Thank you for your attention.